Welcome back to MLA Musings. I'm your host, Josh Campbell. We've got a great show in store for you tonight with some very special guests. But before I introduce our guests, I'd like to give a quick warning. Tonight, our show will delve into sensitive topics like suicide, adult themes, and death. If you have little ears that sometimes listen, you might consider watching this show without them present. Also, if these topics are triggers for you, you might avoid this show altogether. With that said, let's introduce our guest. Please welcome Jane from Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Good evening, Jane.
Good evening, Josh. Thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure, Jane. I appreciate you taking time for the show. Next, please welcome Edna Pontier from Kate Chopin's novel, The Awakening.
Well, hello there. Thanks for inviting me, Jane. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Likewise, Edna.
Finally, let's welcome Delia Jones from Zora Neale Hurston's short story, Sweat. How are you tonight, Delia?
Doing just fine, Josh. Thanks for having me on. Evening, lady.
Betcha. Glad you could make it.
Welcome, Delilah. Nice to meet you.
Good evening. Right back at you, Delia.
Right. Well, I appreciate you all for coming on. Remember that I'm going to ask some pretty hard-hitting questions tonight. I hope you three will be candid with me and our listeners.
Certainly.
I do my best.
I can do that.
Great. Let's get started. Jane, as I mentioned, your story is told by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Would you mind telling any of our listeners unfamiliar with it a little about it?
Thank you for having me, Josh. I appreciate the conversation with you and the other women greatly. Though most conversations tire me greatly, I will do my best to stay present through this podcast, or whichever you call it.
We'll try not to make this too long then. Please continue.
Well, Mrs. Gilman really put herself into the story. She too went through a new term called postpartum psychosis, or postpartum depression, which is something neither I nor my physician husband knew anything about.
I'd always assumed Gilman got a copy of your diary and used that to write her story. Interesting. It's almost like she told her story through you.
Indeed. Our story, well, I will say it is about the prison that is being a woman. Not only do non-women folk not know about being a woman, they also don't understand the female mind. It is perfectly understandable for a woman to have a spell once in a while. It is perfectly acceptable for a man to have one. Why not I? Anyway, I digress. Sorry, I keep running my mouth. It has been so long since I have a normal conversation with someone.
No worry, James. You are welcome to talk as much as you need here.
Well, let's just say after my spell, John has kept a close eye on me. Kind of suffocating, if I'm being honest. Because of my illness, John, his sister, Mary, and I moved. John's idea, of course. I love the house, but I would have rather stayed at my own home, to an old boys' boarding school. At least it had once been used for that purpose. The house was beautiful, a large, delicious garden with roses and trimmed hedges, lovely English-style gates leading to the house, and a beautiful downstairs area, where I originally wanted to stay. The nursery, where I was imprisoned, had awful yellow wallpaper, with a poor old woman trapped inside. Needless to say, that woman and I escaped that dreadful room.
We're glad you escaped, aren't we, ladies?
Oh,
Sure
absolutely.
is.
Let's hear about your story now, Edna. What part of your life did Chopin write about?
Well, you see, my story begins when my husband, Leon Pontier, our two boys and I were vacationing at the cottages of Madame Lebrun. It's a holiday resort for us wealthy folks. Leon was a very devoted husband. I never wanted for anything, but he was often too busy with his work to have time for me. I was left to tend to the children and keep my wifely duties. This, however, bored me, and I felt trapped, that my life was merely going by, and I couldn't seem to be happy with that. After meeting my friend Adele Bretignolle, I realized it was okay to speak my mind, to say that I had desires and wants, a need for freedom, freedom to breathe, to be, and not have to answer to anyone, including my husband and children. You see, us Creole women, we had many restrictions. Our lot was to be submissive and elegant.
Sounds like Adele helped break you out of your monotony.
Oh, yes. Her and Robert Lebrun, I remember the day I met him. There was a air about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but something that spoke to my soul. I had a deep sense of wanting to know more about him. As the days went by, we grew closer and closer. I found myself wanting to find any reason to be near him. We would not be intimate together physically, but oh, in every other way, I say we were.
That sounds all very romantic, your own marriage notwithstanding.
Well, it most certainly was. However, Robert did leave abruptly out of my life near the end of our vacation. My family and I, we returned to our home in New Orleans, and I waited for him to come back. My desires grew stronger than ever.
You were heartbroken, I'm sure.
Oh, I was very sad, yes, but I did seek out the affections of Alcea Robin. He is the town womanizer. Boy, he fanned the flames within me. I could control what I wanted and how I wanted to be. But I did long for Robert. My heart at times ached for him. When Robert came back from Mexico, I thought it was finally going to be just the two of us living out my newfound freedom. However, Robert left again, leaving only a note saying goodbye, and I realized that I would never have him. Even after professing my love for him, I felt completely in control of who I was and what I longed for. I decided to go to that beach again. I realized then I was solely in control of what I wanted, and I felt a freedom as I stripped down out of my clothes. Naked I came into this world, and naked I left.
Well, that's quite a story, Edna. I'm sure we're going to want to pick some of that apart. But first, Delia, why don't you tell us about your story?
Well, let's see. Preston writes about the time me and Sykes was fighting right before he died. See, I used to wash the white folks' laundry for pay, kept us fed, and well, for many years. Sykes, he took up with that birthed woman. Guess he got tired of my old skinny self. He beat me, Sykes did, throughout those years. And one night after taking sacrament, he come in and started giving me a hard time about doing my job. So I stood up to him, told him he done gone too far. Told him I've been married to him for 15 years and I've been taking in washing for 15 years. Sweat, 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 working sweat, crying sweat, praying sweat, I told him.
That made him mad. What happened next?
He come back a few weeks later with a rattlesnake in a box. Told me he was keeping the snake and I could leave if I didn't like it. Well, I'm scared to death of snakes, but I'll be darned if I let him run me out the house. I poured all that work and sweat into. That was my house. So I stayed. And one night when I came home, it was in my laundry hamper. When I got some clothes out, there it was. I ran out the house, spent the night outside in the hay barn. First, I was scared half to death, but as I laid there, I got mad. I was awake all night until Sykes came back into the morning, and that's when it happened.
Well, I can see you're anxious, but you're safe here. That's when what happened, Delia?
That's when Sykes went inside the house and got bit by the snake. I came down out of the hay and went to the window. I heard the snake rattling in the bedroom when Sykes came running in and got bit. I felt real sick. Then Sykes called for me and I couldn't move. I do not rightly know how long it took me, but I finally got up and I saw Sykes crawling away, neck all swollen, and I knew then he was going to die. Nothing would have helped him.
Wow, Delia, that must have been very traumatic for you. We're all glad you're safe and here to join us and share your story. Thank you. Okay, ladies, thank you all for summarizing your stories for our listeners. We're going to shift to the interview segment. Jane, would you like to go first?
Sure, Josh. I do tire so easily. It's probably best that I go first.
All right, then thank you. Can you describe for us what it was like to live in that nursery for so long?
Horrid. Absolutely horrid. I was suffering from postpartum depression. I was not an invalid. and I should not have been left alone in a room like that for as long as I was. The room was previously a nursery. There were bars on the windows. It felt much more like a prison than a place to recover. Even now, I cannot look at the color yellow without feeling physically ill. Freedom suits me just fine, and I dare say I would have recovered easier if I had been given freedom from the start.
Now, both John, your husband, and your brother are physicians. And you insisted over and over that you were unwell. Then they recommended a course of action even though they didn't actually think you were sick. What do you think about their treatment or even their medical diagnosis?
Trapping a sick person in a room all by themselves, not even to be let out for exercise or right, it's degrading. That's probably what really drove me to the edge. I was sick with depression, which wasn't very well understood back then. The lack of understanding of this type of depression and how to treat it left them a little helpless on how to help me. So they prescribed rest and locked me away. The isolation resulted in the development of postpartum psychosis, which is a much later stage in the illness.
You hanging in there, Jane?
I'm okay. This conversation is starting to get to me. Depression, from what I have learned from living in this new era, takes a lot out on the body. That is why I was so tired all the time in my story, where even writing on scraps of paper tired me. Though the thought of tiptoeing around and sneaking around my husband and sister-in-law probably tired me more as well. I apologize. I seem to have run through my thoughts again. To answer your question, Josh, no. Putting someone with depression in a room designed for children somehow made me even more sad. It is important to listen to those around you. And that is all I have to say on that question.
One last question, I'll give you a break. Would you say that what you went through was a form of abuse?
I hate to speak ill of my husband, but, well, I can't say that it was anything other than torture. Abuse is almost too light of a term.
I share that sentiment, Jane. Delia, you're no stranger to abuse. Sykes seemed to have laid hands on you a few times before Hurston tells your story. How do you feel about the abuse Jane endured and how it compares to yours?
Well, I don't know. I feel for you, Jane. Sykes might have beat me. In fact, he started beating me pretty good 2 months after our wedding. And he might have blown all the money he ever earned, making me break my back, sweating over these white folks' clothes. But I had my freedom. I still go to church, walk about town. I don't know, Josh. I can't say for sure one way is worse than another. I know a woman can only take so much before she stands up. That's what I did. I might have pity on how he died, but I do not regret none standing up to him, especially since he was running around with some other woman.
No doubt about that, Delia. Now, Edna, you know a thing or two about standing up for yourself. I love the scene where you stay out in the hammock despite your husband ordering you to come in. But first, tell me a little bit about how Leonce treated you. You mentioned you never wanted for anything, but you also mentioned he kind of neglected you with his work and you felt trapped. Can you think of any instances where Leonce treated you poorly? And if so, how does that relate to your awakening?
Well, it seems to me that my husband had very proprietary feelings towards me, that he owned me. Well, there was this one time I got burned by the sun, and he was scandalized. He seemed less concerned that his wife might suffer some heat sickness than he was about something that belonged to him being damaged. He made me cry about how I took care of the boys, but that's why we had a nanny. I love them, our children. They felt like just another lock on the cage, a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless.
Abuse takes many forms, Edna. For Delia, it was physical and verbal. For Jane, it was emotional and mental. Oppressiveness is a form of abuse, although Leonce did seem to allow you some latitude once you asserted yourself. In a way, the three of you were all oppressed by your husband, fought against it. Tell me about that.
Well, we already talked about how I stood up to Sykes.
We did, but we didn't talk about the most important way you fought against him.
How was that?
By letting him die, Delia.
I didn't do that.
Oh, come on now. We promised honesty, remember? Hurston records that you made eye contact with Sykes as he was dying. You didn't run for help, even if you might have been too late. You didn't try. You just let the venom take its course, right? Lie, I don't blame you. Sykes brought that death on himself. You had to know this was the way you'd finally be free of him, right?
I guess so. I don't feel good about it, and I didn't really think when it was happening. I just poured so much of myself into my marriage, my house, my work. I couldn't let him just give it to that woman, Bertha. That house was my home. I couldn't just let him take it from me. Sykes took everything else from me. I couldn't let him take my peace from me too.
I get it. Hey, I'm not here to judge whether what you did was right or wrong, or whether anyone else would have done something different in your place. What do you think, ladies? Put in Delia's position, would you have acted differently?
I would have done anything to be free of that room, free of my husband's oppression.
I believe that, Jane. You know, the fact that you wrote your own story despite being told not to write is an act of rebellion. We wouldn't have such a clear picture of what women went through without your story.
I hadn't thought about it that way. I was just trying to hold on to what little bit of myself I had left.
Sometimes our desires for freedom makes us do desperate things, Delia.
And you would know that, wouldn't you, Edna?
I sure do.
Why did you take your life? I mean, I have to be honest. I've never really understood why you took that last swim. Why give up when you had achieved so much freedom already?
Because it was my choice to make. I took control of my life. No man would ever tell me what I had to do again. You keep talking about freedom. Now I'm the freest of the bunch.
I guess I can understand that, Edna, but I don't know that I can agree that you're the freest of the bunch when the other two both broke free of their cages that held them, and they went on to live their lives. Your happy ending is that you died? There's got to be a better way than that. Nevertheless, I'm glad you're happy now.
I am too. Happy for Edna, but also for myself. I'm tired, but I'm free of that room, and that woman, and that horrid paper.
And that Sykes would never lay another finger on me again. I'm free to live my life in peace.
That you are. Well, ladies, I think we're out of time. I thank you for coming on visiting with me.
My pleasure.
Mine too.
Same here.
All right, then. Well, that wraps up another edition of MLA Musings. Good night. We'll see you next time.